Number 10, Paul Bernardo had a complicated childhood. First off, let's dive into the childhood of Ken from the Couple Butchers. His parents were financially well off while he was growing up in the 1960s and 70s. The problem wasn't the money though, it was what was going on behind the curtain. In 1975, Paul's father was charged with a really serious crime. Paul was deeply affected by this too. People used to call Paul a happy young boy who smiled a lot, but this was all changed. When Paul turned 16, his mother revealed to him that he was born from an affair his mother had with his real biological father, and this led Paul to start calling his mom offensive names. Paul began picking up women at bars only to humiliate and beat them later. Paul was a good-looking dude, which was definitely for the worst, as he would use his good looks and charm to manipulate women and take down their guard. I took a look at this guy and hey, I'd be fooled if he came up to me. He's one handsome guy, you know? I'm just saying. Number 9, his crimes before the coupling. Between 1987 and 1990, Toronto's Scarborough district was rocked by a series of vicious abuses. The mystery attacker was targeting women, most of whom traveled by bus late at night. As the attacks grew increasingly violent, a police task force was established as a priority. Plainclothes detectives began to stake out bus stations, and in May 1988, an officer spotted a suspect matching the attacker's description lingering under a tree. The suspect escaped on foot but was later identified as Paul Bernardo. Despite the close shave, Bernardo seemed incapable of slowing down. By 1990, police had received 3 separate tips leading directly to him. The first came from an ex-girlfriend, who shared her experience of Bernardo's violent, intimate behavior with a friend in law enforcement. The second came from a bank teller who recognized Bernardo after seeing a composite sketch of the abuser. The final tip came from Tina Smyrnis, the wife of Bernardo's lifelong friend. Smyrnis also saw a likeness in the composite and had been witness to Bernardo's expressions of intimate deviance. Supposedly, Bernardo told his friends of his wishes to commit these crimes. Now, I just wonder how he didn't get arrested sooner. I mean, if my friends came up to me and told me they wanted to abuse a bunch of women just like out of nowhere for fun, I'd report him to the police. Number 8, Leslie Mahaffey. On Sunday, June 16, 1991, Bernardo and Homolka hosted a Father's Day meal in their home. Dorothy and Carol Homolka, along with their surviving daughter Lori, spent the evening celebrating with the couple. Carla is reported to have spent the night making an effort to keep the family upstairs, and for good reason. The body of Leslie Mahaffey was lying just meters below in the basement, having been moved from the bedroom shortly before the Homolka's arrival. Later that night, Bernardo dismembered the body of the teenager with a circular saw. At some point during the evening of June 14th, Leslie had disappeared after attending the viewing of a friend who had passed away in a car accident. It was nothing unusual, Leslie was a frequent runaway, but when she failed to attend the funeral the next day, her family began to panic. Leslie's body was discovered encased in concrete on June 29th, 1991, the same day Bernardo and Homolka married. Speaking of their marriage, let's go more in depth about that topic. Number 7, who Paul married. Paul met Carla Homolka back in 1987 when he was 23 and she was 17. Carla was the eldest of 3 siblings. She was described by people as well-adjusted, pretty, smart, and popular, with a fondness of animals that led her to start working in a veterinary clinic. When Paul and Carla met, sparks flew instantly, and they hit it off. They were immediately attracted to each other. To sweeten the deal, Paul realized that Carla shared his sick and twisted fantasies. They formed a twisted and sick relationship where Paul was the abusive master and Carla was a willing servant. While they were dating, Paul was also intimately abusive towards a trove of women in Scarborough with Carla's knowledge and approval. Bernardo and Homolka eventually became engaged. Homolka described to a friend how Paul and I are happier than ever. He's being so great, so romantic, but that's typical of my honey. But the truth was that 3 years into their relationship, Paul Bernardo got bored. He complained to Homolka that she was not a virgin when they met, and soon turned his sick attention elsewhere, to Homolka's sister, Tammy. Far from being outraged at Bernardo's desires, Homolka once again encouraged them, and she told Bernardo that she wanted him to give her little sister's virginity for a Christmas present. Seriously, these people should have been stopped sooner. These two are such scumbags, I don't even know how to react anymore. Number 6, Tammy's execution might have been an accident. It has been largely accepted that Tammy's passing was an accident. Bernardo and Homolka had only intended to subdue and abuse their victim. However, journalist Trish Wood and numerous medical experts believed that Karla knew precisely what she was doing. She had stolen a bottle of halothane, a liquid form of anesthetic, from the veterinary clinic she worked at. As an animal health technician, Homolka had a working knowledge of halothane. She was aware that the anesthetic should be administered through a vaporizer and that animals under the substance should have a breathing tube inserted. During testimony, Karla admitted that she had done her research before subduing Tammy. She ultimately chose to use the sleeping tablet Halcyon after studying the compendium of pharmaceuticals and specialties and discovering that termination was not listed as an outcome. However, the same cannot be said of halothane. Basically, the whole thing could have been an accident, but it could just as easily have been purposeful. Number 5, their first execution. Paul and Karla ended up removing Tammy, Karla's sister. Rather than sate Paul Bernardo's appetite for blood, the execution of Tammy Lynn Homolka only increased it. In 1991, Homolka lured another teenager she had befriended at work to the home she now shared with Paul Bernardo. The couple again subdued the girl, abused her, and videotaped it. Only this time the victim survived and woke up with no memory of the horrific events. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka married on June 29, 1991. The very same day, a horrified couple canoeing in Lake Gibson discovered concrete blocks containing human body parts in the water. The remains belonged to Leslie Mahaffey, mentioned earlier, who had disappeared on June 15th. She had been kidnapped by the Ken and Barbie butchers and abused over the course of several days. As this grisly discovery was made, the butchers enjoyed an elaborate wedding ceremony which included their entrance in a white horse-drawn carriage. Almost a year later, on April 16, 1992, the couple struck again, this time grabbing and ending Kristen French. They left her body battered and her hair partially shaved in a ditch along a rural road. It took local law enforcement 11 whole days just to find her body. What, were they taking naps collectively or something? The worst part is that they were already investigating the whole situation. Number 4, their last victim left clues. Kristen French was the final victim in the infamous schoolgirl executions. She was kidnapped in a parking lot after being approached by Homolka, who was posing as a tourist in need of directions. Bernardo approached from behind and forced the teen into the couple's car. By this point, Bernardo and Homolka had become brazen in their operation. Kristen was approached in broad daylight and her abduction was witnessed by several people. Unfortunately, the vehicle used in her abduction was wrongly identified by witnesses. Despite this, Kristen fought hard to leave a trail of clues in her wake. Her shoe was found at the scene of the abduction, along with a portion of a Toronto road map. The torn off section of the map was later forensically tested and many believe that Kristen left it behind in the struggle. Prosecutors commended French for her apparent bravery during her captivity, quoting the girl as having claimed that some things are worth passing away for, much to the frustration of Bernardo. Kristen French was found gone from this world on April 30th, 1992, not far from the burial site of Leslie Mahaffey. Thanks to Kristen French, the clues left behind were used to find Bernardo and Homolka and put a stop to their crimes. Fly high, French. Number 3, Paul Bernardo was a failed rap artist. Bernardo harbored a surprising passion for music. He was particularly fond of rap, and many former friends describe him as quoting artist Vanilla Ice. Bernardo didn't just consider himself a fan. He had aspirations of pursuing a music career, going so far as to purchase recording equipment with money he made smuggling tobacco across the US border. Bernardo indulged in grandiose fantasies, often assuring his friends that famous artists were interested in sponsorship deals. His lyrics were a disturbing insight into his crimes, spurred on by Homolka.
Did you ever get caught? No, never. Why? They say. Did you ever get caught? Did you ever get caught? No, never, never. Why?
She often bragged to friends about Bernardo's upcoming albums. Bernardo even took his final victim into his music room to show her his latest tracks, though Homolka would later testify that Kristen French did not care. All I'm saying is that this guy Paul Bernardo clearly did not have the bars. Number 2, the trial. Realizing the gig was up, Karla Homolka quickly got a lawyer and sought a plea bargain in exchange for testifying against Paul Bernardo. She claimed Bernardo had told her he'd abuse at least 30 women. The government agreed to a 12-year sentence in exchange for her cooperation. Although this backfired dramatically when the videotapes the couple had made showcasing their gruesome crimes were discovered, and Homolka's true nature was revealed. Karla Homolka was not the abused victim she had attempted to portray herself as, but rather a cruel sadist. Homolka was ultimately released in 2005 and since remarried and given birth. Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all charges against him and consequently sentenced to life for the abuse, slaughter, and kidnap of 2 teenage girls. though it is believed he ended a couple more. His abuse victims number somewhere in the double digits, presumably around 13. Bernardo's application for parole in 2018 after 25 years in prison was denied after only 30 minutes of deliberation. A lawyer on behalf of the victims' families reported that there's never been an apology by Paul Bernardo. There's never even been any indication whatsoever of remorse. Indeed, Bernardo admitted to the court that he hadn't felt anything for his victims at the time of his crimes. A lot of the time you see criminals pretend to be insane or backpedal and apologize for their crimes. So it's almost refreshing seeing a criminal you know you can't sympathize with. Like you know without a doubt in your mind that these guys are the worst. Number 1, Homolka sold out to Bernardo. Early in January 1993, Bernardo attacked his wife with a flashlight during an argument. The beating was severe, leaving Homolka admitted to the hospital with black eyes and broken ribs. It was this incident that encouraged her to leave Bernardo for good. Around this time, Toronto police reached out to Homolka. Forensic experts working on the Scarborough abuses had finally run tests on Bernardo's sample. He was identified as the Scarborough abuser, and detectives suspected a connection to the executions of Mahaffey and French. Homolka agreed to an interview with police, assuming they wanted to discuss the assault with the flashlight. However, detectives from the Green Ribbon Task Force, established to investigate the schoolgirl slaughters, were present at the interview. Homolka ultimately panicked and confessed everything to her family. She was quick to seek out an attorney and cut a deal with investigators to give them information on the slaughters. Homolka sold out Bernardo in exchange for a lesser sentence.
Because now my file says her version, and it's a lie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I'm not making frivolous points here.
It really do be your own homies. Number 10, the temper. Capone prided himself on keeping his temper under wraps, but when friend and fellow hood Jack Guzik was assaulted by a small-time thug, Capone tracked the assailant down and shot him until he departed in a bar. Due to a lack of witnesses, Capone got away with the cold-blooded execution, but the publicity surrounding the case gave him a notoriety that he never had before. Capone spent his early years hanging around the docks along the Brooklyn Navy Yard around his home. He was a good student in his youth, but at the age of 14, while attending PS 133, Capone struck a teacher in the face. According to some accounts, Capone was expelled. According to others, he left the school himself. Whatever the case, he never went back. Number 9, the Massacre. Capone also had to deal with rival gangster Bugs Moran and his Northsiders gang, who had been a threat for years. Moran had even once tried to end Capone's colleague and friend, Jack McGurn. The decision by Capone and McGurn to avail themselves of Moran was to lead one of the most infamous gangland massacres in history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On Thursday, February 14th, 1929, at 10:30 in the morning, Moran and his gang were lured by a bootlegger into a garage to buy whiskey.
Yeah, hello. Mr. Kane. He just stepped out. Any message?
Yeah. Tell him his shirts is ready.
McGurn's men would be waiting for them dressed in stolen police uniforms, the idea being that they would stage a fake raid. McGurn, like Capone, made sure he was far away and checked into a hotel with his girlfriend. When McGurn's men thought they saw Moran, they got into their police uniforms and drove over to the garage in a stolen police car. Which were easy to get in the 20s, I guess. The bootleggers caught in the act lined up against the wall. McGurn's men took the bootleggers' guns and opened fire with 2 machine guns.
Hello, boys. Something I can do for you?
Yeah, you can shut up.
I'll line up, all of you. Face that wall.
All the men except Frank Gusenberg were slain outright in cold blood. The plan appeared to go brilliantly, except for one major detail. Moran was not among the men. Moran had seen the police car and took off, not wanting to be caught up in the raid.
Lousy cops. They sure picked a swell time to get nosy.
Hell of a note if Sorella shows up with the booze with them still in there. Let's get a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I could use one.
Even though Capone was conveniently in Florida, the police and the newspapers knew who staged the massacre. Number 8, the dinners.
This is the time for what? For individual achievement.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became a national media event, immortalizing Capone as the most ruthless, feared, smartest, and elegant of gangland bosses. Even while powerful forces were amassing against him, Capone indulged in one last bloody act of revenge, the removal of 2 Sicilian colleagues whom he believed had betrayed him. Capone invited his victims to a sumptuous banquet, where he brutally pulverized them with a baseball bat.
I get nowhere unless the team wins.
Team.
Capone had observed the old tradition of wining and dining traitors before executing them. It's like a last meal while on the execution penalty, but so much more gruesome. Somewhat ironically, it was the pen pushers from the tax office who posed the greatest threat to the gangsters' bootlegging empires. In May 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that a bootlegger had to pay income tax on his illegal bootlegging business. With such a ruling, it wasn't long before the small special intelligence unit of the IRS under Elmer Eyre was able to go after Capone. Number 7. The Scar. Under Torrio's tutelage, Capone was introduced to Brooklyn racketeer Frankie Yale, aka Frankie Uel. He hired Capone as a bartender and occasional bouncer at the Coney Island dance hall and saloon he owned called the Harvard Inn. Kinda funny, Frankie Yale owns the Harvard Inn? I'm sorry. The story goes that while working there, Capone allegedly insulted the sister of a local petty felon named Frank Galluccio, who promptly slashed him with a pocket knife across the face 3 times. But a reporter found a December 1918 article in the Brooklyn Daily Times that said one Alfonso Capone was approached by 2 men and had his cheek slashed by a knife, though the paper gets the side of the face wrong. Alongside other evidence, the reporter speculates that Capone had insulted Galluccio's sister at a different dance hall, and then Galluccio found Capone at a restaurant and attacked him. No matter what happened, the healed wounds eventually led to Capone's infamous Scarface name, a moniker he did not care for. He preferred to be called Snorky by his closest friends, a reference to his fashion sense. Later, Capone told people he sustained the 3 scars from shrapnel while fighting in France during WW1, even though he had not actually gone there. Number 6. The Move. There are 2 stories about how Capone ended up in Chicago. According to one, it was because Capone had assaulted a member of a rival gang called the White Hand, which warned them that there would be retribution. This prompted Yale to send Capone and his family west to work for Torrio, who had moved to the Windy City to work for Chicago outfit kingpin James Big Jim Colosimo in 1909. This doesn't sound a lot like Capone's idea though. I mean, come on, do you guys think Capone would move to Chicago to avoid conflict? He doesn't seem that emotionally intelligent to me. According to the other theory, Capone moved because Torrio wanted his protege to be his underboss. Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919 shortly after, and Colosimo perished with either Capone or Yale doing the whacking, and Torrio became the boss. Number 5. The Bat.
Baseball.
Capone usually had his minions do his dirty work, but sometimes he took matters into his own hands. Take, for example, when a Sicilian mobster named Joe Aiello persuaded some of Capone's own Chicago outfit gangsters, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Giunta, to overthrow the gangster, and one of Capone's bodyguards, Frank Rio, uncovered the plot. As author John Kobler writes in Capone, The Life and World of Al Capone, Scarface invited the men to the dinner, the traditional hospitality before execution. When the meal was over, he revealed to them that he knew about their treachery. Then, Capone's bodyguards tied the men to their chairs, and Capone stood up, grabbing a baseball bat. Slowly, he walked the length of the table and halted behind the first guest of honor. With both hands, he lifted the bat and slammed it down full force. Slowly, methodically, he struck again and again, breaking bones in the man's shoulders, arms, and chest. He moved to the next man, and when he was reduced to mangled flesh and bone, to the third. One of the bodyguards then fetched his revolver from the check room and shot each man in the back of the head. Gross. Capone just turns people into mincemeat, I guess. Number 4. The Money. After arriving in Chicago, Capone worked for Torrio, who was part of a criminal network headed by a man named Big Jim Colosimo. When Colosimo was removed, possibly as a hit ordered by Torrio and carried out by Capone's former boss Frankie Yale, Torrio took over as boss and made Capone one of his key aides. In January 1925, Torrio was gunned down outside his Illinois home. He survived the attack but left Chicago later that year, choosing 26-year-old Capone as his replacement. Capone expanded the outfit, as he referred to his underworld organization, and went on to become one of America's leading mobsters. By some estimates, his crime syndicate pulled in around $100 million a year, the largest portion from bootlegging, followed by gambling, streetwalking, racketeering, and other illicit activities. A flashy dresser who liked chatting with reporters and became an international celebrity, Capone didn't apologize for the way he made his living. He claimed to be doing a public service for Chicagoans, stating, "90% of the people of Cook County drink and gamble, and my offense has been to furnish them with those amusements." Number 3. The conviction. Although he controlled a criminal empire and ordered hits on a multitude of his enemies, Capone managed to avoid prosecution for years by paying off police and public officials and threatening witnesses. The mob boss finally was slapped with his first criminal conviction in May 1929, after he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia. At the time, he was on his way back to Chicago following a summit of organized crime honchos in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and swiftly sentenced to a year in jail. He was freed in March 1930, and a month later the Chicago Crime Commission released its first ever list of the city's worst criminals. Capone was named public enemy number 1. Meanwhile, on orders from President Herbert Hoover to nail Capone, the federal government built a case against the crime boss for income tax fraud, and in June 1931, he was indicted on charges of tax evasion. Capone agreed to a plea deal that included a recommended prison sentence of 2.5 years. However, the judge in the case refused to accept the deal. Capone withdrew his guilty plea and the case went to trial. At the start of the highly publicized proceedings, the judge switched out the pool of prospective jurors after learning bribes had been offered in an effort to seat a Capone-friendly jury. In October 1931, the all-male jury, Illinois didn't allow female jurors until 1939, found the gangster guilty of 5 charges, 3 felonies and 2 misdemeanors, of the more than 20 counts against him. He was sentenced to 11 years behind bars and fined $50,000. It was the harshest sentence delivered for tax fraud up to that point. Number 2. The Island. In May 1932, 33-year-old Capone began his sentence for tax evasion at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. 2 years later, in August 1934, he and a group of fellow inmates were sent by train to California, then transported to the recently opened federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The maximum security prison, intended to hold criminals who were especially violent or had other disciplinary problems, had received its first contingent of federal inmates earlier that August. Because Capone wasn't a troublemaker while locked up in Atlanta, he likely was sent to Alcatraz as a way for the government to generate publicity for its tough new facility. While at Alcatraz, Capone, who had been diagnosed with syphilis during a medical exam at the Atlanta Penitentiary, started showing signs of the disease, including dementia. As his condition worsened, prison doctors treated him with malaria injections in the hope that the fevers caused by malaria would wipe out the syphilis. Instead, the treatment nearly proved fatal for Capone. In January 1939, he was released from Alcatraz and transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island, near Los Angeles, to serve his 1-year misdemeanor sentence. Number 1. The disease. Capone was released from prison in November 1939, then underwent several months of treatment for syphilis at a Baltimore hospital. Afterward, the famous gangster spent much of his time out of the public spotlight, fishing and playing cards at the Palm Island, Florida mansion he'd owned since 1928. In the 1940s, he became one of the first civilians to receive penicillin for syphilis, although it was too late to cure him. In January 1947, the 48-year-old Capone suffered a stroke, then came down with pneumonia. He passed away at his Florida home on January 25th. Capone was buried at Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery near the graves of his father and one of his brothers. In 1950, the Capone family had the remains of the 3 men moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Number 10. His outlandish admission to attempting to make zombies. The executing was a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that. That's why I tried to create living zombies with uric acid in the drill to the head. But it never worked. No, the executing was not the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control, not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted. This admission is extremely unsettling and hard to believe. Jeffrey Dahmer would often inject various fluids into the brains of his victims in an attempt to create the perfect obedient servant. Number 9. his creepy obsession with being close with all of his victims. I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with 10 different skulls and skeletons. It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. If I couldn't keep them with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons. This isn't the first time Dahmer explained how he wanted to keep the victims with him, but this one chills me the most. This quote, paired with the realization that he was consuming his victims, is just one of those things you only hear about in movies. Multiple people tried to expose his crimes before he was actually arrested, but because of racism and homophobia from the authorities, he was allowed to continue. Number 8. The quote of completely admitting to the execution of his victims. To this day, I don't know what started it, the murders. The person to blame is sitting right across from you. It's the only person, not parents, not society, not adult content. I mean, those are just excuses. This quote is especially freaky because he just outright admits that he was the only reason he did the things he did. Dahmer was an extremely ill man. His childhood consisted of his mother almost taking her own life and his father being neglectful. Unfortunately for Dahmer, this quote is most likely untrue. It is a well-known and studied theory that early childhood development plays a large role in the development of psychopathy, especially when exposed to a dysfunctional family. Number 7. His explanation of why he was unempathetic and had an immoral attitude. If a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behaviors to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believe the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from slime. When we passed, that was it. There's nothing. Dahmer's religion is very confusing and convoluted. He used to be of the Christian faith, but somewhere along the road he switched. The ideology from this quote comes from his earlier beliefs as an atheist. However, after the executions and some time until his trial, he seemingly completely converted into Christianity again, going so far as to quote the Bible directly during confessions. Number 6. His first execution. I wasn't looking for anyone, but about a mile away from the house, there he was, hitchhiking along the road. He wasn't wearing a shirt, he was attractive. I was attracted to him. I stopped, then passed him and stopped the car and thought, well, should I pick him up or not? And I asked him if he wanted to go back and engage in substance use. And he said, oh yeah. And we went into my bedroom, had some drinks, and from the time I spent with him, I could tell he wasn't gay. I didn't know how else to keep him there other than to get the barbell and to hit him over the head, which I did, then strangled him with the same barbell. Dahmer's first victim was Stephen Hicks in 1991. He was especially brutal when it came to how he treated him even after his passing. The parents of Stephen once wished that Dahmer could feel their agony. His father stated that Stephen would never miss a Christmas, and that's how he knew he wasn't coming back before he was pronounced deceased. Number 5. When he came to peace with himself after his admission. Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted to pass for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did, but not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. Perhaps one of the most unnerving things about the peculiar case of Jeffrey Dahmer would be how calm and collected he was during his interviews and trials. He always seemed like a calculated criminal, which probably led to the internet giving so much attention to the recent Netflix documentary. Number 4. When he accepted his own sociopathic tendencies regarding his emotionless stoicism. I don't even know if I have the capacity for normal emotions or not, because I haven't cried for a long time. You just stifle them for so long that maybe you lose them, partially at least. I don't know. It has been proven that stifling emotions can be extremely detrimental to your mental health. It often leads to substance abuse or mental ailments like depression and anxiety. Dahmer had the worst of it all, leading him to his horrific actions, as he had stifled them for so long that he had lost all remorse. Number 3. When he explained how he had no real meaning of life, and called his life story sick and depressing. I couldn't find any meaning for my life when I was out there. I'm sure as hell not gonna find it here. This is the grand finale of a life poorly spent, and the end result is just overwhelmingly depressing. It's just a sick, pathetic, wretched, miserable life story. How it can help anyone, I've no idea. Dahmer's father published a book titled A Father's Story in 1994, describing how it felt to be Jeffrey's father. He explained in said book how he was negligent and contemplated reasons on why his son had turned out the way he did. Lionel Dahmer often blamed himself for the severe flaws of his son, Jeffrey. Number 2. His reaction to his inability to continue doing what he has done. It's just like a big chunk of me is being ripped out and I'm not quite whole. I don't think I'm over-dramatizing it, and I'm certainly deserving of it, but the way I feel now, it's just like you're talking to someone who is terminally ill and facing execution. Execution would be preferable to what I am facing. I just feel like imploding upon myself, you know? I just want to go somewhere and disappear. Dahmer has said in previous interviews how the executions were never enough. He would perform one and say, maybe the next one will do it, maybe the one after that, and he would inevitably just keep going. Number 1, his final quote ever. He is reported as saying this: "I don't care if I live or perish. Go ahead and remove me." Jeffrey Dahmer said this as his last words, but he didn't pass away from the execution penalty. He was actually hit by a fellow inmate and passed away while in prison. The harrowing life of Jeffrey Dahmer is sure to be kept in the history books for a long time, and his case should be an example of how everyone can be more careful with strangers, raising their kids, and reporting crimes to the authorities when you can. At number 10, the Zodiac Killer was infamous for leaving ciphers and codes at the scene of many crimes, some of which are still unknown to this day. Zodiac loved to toy with law enforcement, often completely mocking them in the notes he'd leave behind. One of his quotes is this: "I want to report an assassination. No, a double assassination. They are 2 miles north of Park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Gia. I'm the one who did it." There he goes, toying with the police. Many criminals have tried to mess with the cops while on the run, but most of them got caught in the end. Zodiac was clearly too smart for that. Number 9, Zodiac had many wishes and thoughts about the future. His thoughts of what happens after passing away are definitely out there. "I like ending people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than ending a wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To remove something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I pass away, I'll be reborn in paradise, and all that I have ended will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow me down or stop my collection of slaves for my afterlife." That's the craziest theory for the afterlife I've ever heard. At number 8, as said earlier, Zodiac just loves clowning the cops. Want another example? Here's another quote from him: "The police shall never catch me because I have been too clever for them." See? He's honestly just trolling them at this point. And the worst part is that he was right. The police really did never catch him. The Zodiac ended 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969, operating in rural, urban, and suburban settings. He targeted young couples and a lone male cab driver. His known attacks took place in Benicia, Vallejo, unincorporated Napa County, and the city of San Francisco proper. 2 of his wounded victims survived. The Zodiac claimed to have executed 37 victims. He's been linked to several other cold cases, some in Southern California or just outside the state. Number 7, the Zodiac didn't just threaten and make fun of the police. On some occasions, he sent letters to newsletters and publishers. Here's a note he sent to the Chronicle. "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am rather unhappy because you people will not wear some nice Zodiac symbol buttons. So I now have a list, starting with the woman, that I have a rather interesting ride for a couple hours one evening a few months back that ended in my burning her car where I found them." It seems here that he's alluding to an assassination he committed involving burning a woman's car. The thing is, no such execution was found in link to the Zodiac. Was he making it up, or have the police just not found him? By the way, I said that note as it was written. He has like purpose spelling mistakes in all of his notes. It's very confusing. Number 6, aren't convinced he hates the police? I got another quote for you of him ridiculing them. Here it is. "This is the Zodiac speaking. Like I have always said, I am crack proof. If the blue meanies are ever going to catch me, they had best get off their fat butts and do something, because the longer they fiddle and fart around, the more slaves I will collect for my afterlife. I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. The reason I'm writing to the Times is this: they don't bury me on the back pages like some of the others." Zodiac intentionally spells many words in his notes incorrectly, along with adding various letters and numbers at the bottom of the notes occasionally. This is to give hints and clues for the police detectives to solve the ciphers he gives them. At number 5, when Zodiac stated that he would make things much harder for the police. "This is the Zodiac speaking. Up to the end of October 1st, I have ended 7 people. I have grown rather angry with the police for their telling lies about me. So I shall change the way of the collecting of slaves. I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my crimes. They shall look like routine robberies, executions of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc. I'm sure this slowed down the hunt for the Zodiac, as without his announcements, an execution could be from anyone. Copycats were sure to be happy about this, as they could pretend to be the Zodiac when they execute people." Number 4, when he wrote a note on the back of a comic strip. The Zodiac plays the police and the public like a joke. He attempts humor occasionally, and this quote is one of these times. This is the Zodiac speaking. I thought you would need a good laugh before you hear the bad news, and I can't do a thing with you. Could you print this new cipher on your front page? I get awfully lonely when I am ignored, so lonely I could do my thing. The reference of needing a good laugh is because he has the note on a comic strip. The Zodiac threatens to continue his crimes if the ciphers don't get posted on the front page of the newspaper, chilling the editors, I'm sure. Number 3, when the Zodiac threatened a detective. On October 27, 1970, Chronicle reporter Paul Avery, who had been covering the Zodiac case, received a Halloween card signed with a letter Z and the Zodiac's crossed circle symbol. Handwritten inside the card was the note, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." The threat was taken seriously and was the subject of a front-page story in the Chronicle. Soon after receiving the letter, Avery received an anonymous letter alerting him to the similarities between the Zodiac's activities and the unsolved execution of Sherry Jo Bates, which had occurred 4 years earlier at the City College in Riverside in the greater Los Angeles area, more than 400 miles or 640 kilometers south of San Francisco. Avery reported his findings in the Chronicle on November 16, 1970. Number 2, when he explained his initials and left a bad movie review. Of further communications sent by the public to members of the news social media, some contained similar characteristics of previous Zodiac writings. The Chronicle received a letter postmarked February 14, 1974, informing the editor that the initials for the Symbionese Liberation Army spelled out an Old Norse word meaning execute. However, the handwriting was not authenticated as the Zodiac's. A letter to the Chronicle, postmarked May 8, 1974, featured a complaint that the movie Badlands was execution glorification and asked the paper to cut its advertisements. Signed only a citizen. The handwriting, tone, and surface irony were all similar to earlier Zodiac communications. The Chronicle subsequently received an anonymous letter, postmarked July 8, 1974, complaining of their publishing the writings of the anti-feminist columnist Marco Spinelli. The letter was signed The Red Phantom, Red with Rage. The Zodiac's authorship of this letter is debated. Number 1, his last note. On March 3, 2007, an American greeting Christmas card sent to the Chronicle, postmarked 1990, in Eureka, was rediscovered in their photo files by editorial assistant Daniel King. This letter was handed over to the Vallejo police. Inside the envelope with the card was a photocopy of 2 US postal keys on a magnet keychain. The handwriting on the envelope resembles Zodiac's print, but was declared inauthentic by forensic document examiner Lloyd Cunningham. However, not all Zodiac experts agree with Cunningham's analysis. There is no return address on the envelope, nor is his crossed circle signature to be found. The card itself is unmarked. The Chronicle turned over all the material to the Vallejo police for further analysis. Number 10, what Clyde said to Bonnie's mom when they were all over the newspapers. "Now, Miss Parker, don't you believe what you read in all them newspapers. That's the law talking there. They want us to look big, so they gonna look big when they catch us. And they ain't gonna catch us." Clyde had a spotty relationship with Bonnie at times. Even before their crime spree, Clyde made it clear that he ain't no lover boy, in his own words. He absolutely wasn't, for a while. I mean, one thing that probably brought them closer and further apart at the same time was their shared limp. Clyde would walk with a limp because of something really stupid he did when he was thrown in the slammer. While serving a 14-year sentence in Texas for robbery and automobile theft in January 1932, Clyde decided he could no longer endure the unforgiving work and brutal conditions at the notoriously tough Eastham prison farm. In the hopes of forcing a transfer to a less harsh facility, Clyde severed his left big toe and a portion of his second toe with an axe, although it is not known whether he or another person wielded the sharp instrument. The self-mutilation, which permanently crippled his walking stride and prevented him from wearing shoes while driving, ultimately proved unnecessary, as he was released on parole 6 days later. On the night of June 10, 1933, Clyde, with Bonnie in the passenger seat, was speeding along the rural roads of North Texas so quickly that he missed a detour sign warning of a bridge under construction. The duo's Ford V8 smashed through a barricade at 70 miles per hour and sailed through the air before landing in a dry riverbed. Scalding acid poured out of the car battery and severely burned Bonnie's right leg, eating away at her flesh down to the bone in some places. As a result of the third-degree burns, Bonnie, like Clyde, walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of her life, and she had such difficulty walking that at times she hopped or needed Clyde to carry her. So, he was the reason she could never walk the same again, but also, now they at least share something in common, right? Number 9, when Clyde said the papers were lying. Shoot, if we'd done half that stuff they said we'd done in the paper, we'd be millionaires by now, wouldn't we? The myth about Bonnie and Clyde, portrayed in the 1930s, surely until now, is often understood to be the fact of how they acted and were active in the area. The myth promotes the idea of a romantic couple in stylish clothes who broke the bonds of convention and became a threat to the status quo, who didn't fear the police and lived a life of glamorous luxury outrunning them. The reality was different though. Sometimes stupid, often careless, Bonnie and Clyde and the Barrow gang lived a hard, uneasy life, punctuated by narrow escapes, ruined robberies, injury, and execution. They became one of the first outlaw media stars after some photos of them fooling around with guns were found by police, and the myth-making machine began to work its transformative magic. Soon fame would turn sour and their lives would end in a bloody police ambush, but their dramatic and untimely end would only add luster to their legend. The myths surely gave birth to a misconception that the two were making off with thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars from their robberies, which promptly peeved off the pair as they were making their escape from the law. This definitely didn't help in their attempts to flee, as since the newspapers propagated a public menace roaming the streets, robbing banks and taking lives, the police had to be active and quick for their search and apprehendment or destruction of the fugitives. If not swift, the police would face backlash from the public and questions asking why they aren't trying hard enough. Surely, Clyde knew that fact all too well when he said those words earlier. Number 8, ride or try. You know what I want to say instead of try, I just can't say it because of YouTube know who breathing on my neck. Miss Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow are best known for robbing banks, small-time stores, and gas stations, and perhaps they're the best known pair of criminals from the 1920s to 1930s. While Bonnie and Clyde may not have a catchphrase that I'm aware of, they're perhaps best remembered by the poems that Bonnie wrote. Clyde also lent his hand to a few poems, but most likely this was just to please Bonnie. It was Bonnie who loved writing poems. She even sent a few to local newspapers who were only too happy to print them. I mean, imagine the exposure. One poem ends, "I'll never leave your side, my dear Clyde. I'll ride till I try." This is where the ride or try quote came from. So all of you watching who are looking for your so-called ride or try, you can credit Bonnie Parker for her genius writing skills. If not for her, you wouldn't have your classic phrase to say after all. Number 7, a threat from the mother. This one is coming from Bonnie's mother, but I'm still counting it because it's important for the context of the relationship between the criminal duo. After telling Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, not to listen to the newspapers, Clyde went on to say that Bonnie wouldn't want to live too far from her mama, and explained Bonnie's plan to live 3 miles away from her maternal figure. Emma was never a fan of Clyde. She always disagreed with their relationship, and her response to Bonnie and Clyde moving into their neighborhood, "You'll be shot if you live 3 miles away from me, Clyde Barrow." Ouch. Right up until the day she passed away, Emma Parker refused to let Bonnie and Clyde be buried together. Instead, Clyde was buried in a shared grave with his brother, and Bonnie was buried somewhere else in Texas. How did Clyde's mother feel about Bonnie though? Clyde Barrow's mother, Cumi, denied that she had ever met Bonnie Parker, but facts show that this wasn't true. In fact, it was Cumi Barrow who helped the lovebirds stay on the run for so long. After Bonnie's leg was badly burned in the car accident mentioned before, Cumi helped find a doctor who could write a prescription for laudanum to help Bonnie deal with the pain. The prescription was made out to and picked up by Cumi's niece. Cumi also helped the pair by buying them clothes and packing food for the outlaws. She always knew when they were coming because someone would throw a bottle against the fence that contained a note with phrases that would only mean something to Cumi. While there is no record of it, many assume that Clyde would give money to his mother. Cumi Barrow would then bribe local police, perhaps to ignore their house on the days that Clyde and Bonnie would visit. After Bonnie and Clyde had been executed, Cumi was arrested for aiding and abetting criminals. She denied everything but was found guilty. During sentencing, the judge literally asked Cumi if 60 days sounded fair. Number 6, what Bonnie said about the relationship. "They may hate us together, but they can't stop us," uttered Bonnie to Clyde. What was Bonnie's take on their relationship though? Well, let's take a dive into her previous relationship and see where we end up. 6 days before turning 16, Bonnie married high school classmate Roy Thornton. The marriage fell apart quickly within months, and Bonnie never saw her husband after he was imprisoned for robbery in 1929. It seems like Bonnie had a thing for bad boys. Soon after, Bonnie met Clyde, and although the pair fell in love, she never divorced Thornton. On the day Bonnie and Clyde were removed from the world in 1934, she was still wearing Thornton's wedding ring and actually had a tattoo on the side of her right thigh with 2 interconnected hearts labeled Bonnie and Roy. Although she was now with Clyde and deeply in love, she could probably see that the two weren't getting along as she hoped. His refusal of her wild advances is so stern it's not only jarring, it's completely at odds with the persisting image of the young couple. 2 kids wildly in love as they throw all caution to the wind on their criminal rampage. In the scene in the Bonnie and Clyde movie, which takes place after their first robbery together, Bonnie is completely enthralled. She's high on the thrill of it, and as Clyde makes their getaway, she kisses him passionately as they drive. It's exactly the kind of scene you'd expect. But Clyde immediately flips the script, tossing Bonnie aside as he tells her that that's simply not who he is. Clyde was not all into that lovey-dovey stuff. Number 5, Clyde's poem. Bonnie was generally the more poetic and literate one of the pair, but Clyde did begrudgingly offer up a few poems for himself. Here's one of them. We don't want to hurt anyone, but we have to steal to eat. And if it's a shootout to live, that's the way it will have to be. We have kidnapped some people and tied them to a tree, but not so tight that after we were gone, they could not get themselves free. We are going home tomorrow to look in on the folks. We will meet then out near Grapevine if the laws don't get there first. Now that's not as good as Bonnie's, so I guess I will call it a flop. But please God, just one more visit before we are put on the spot. You would probably look at the similarities between Bonnie's poems and Clyde's poems and outright cross out his penmanship, and on the actual grammatical side, I agree. However, the content of the poem here is actually pretty good in my opinion. He wants to see this one spot near Grapevine before the police find them and take them out, even praying to God that they can visit it one more time before they depart from this world and on to the next. Funny enough, he actually makes fun of himself in the poem too. He says his poem's not as good as Bonnie's and that he calls his own writing skills a flop. Don't be so hard on yourself, Clyde. It's hard to write under pressure, especially when the pressure is the police. Number 4, what Clyde told his mother about working. Mama, I'm never gonna work again. And I'll never stand arrest either. I'm not ever going back to that Eastham hellhole. I'll pass away first. I swear it. They're gonna have to end me. Clyde must have had a massive disdain for the authority in his town and the prison they kept him in, because him saying he'd rather pass away than spend another day in prison is a big thing to say. It makes sense once you realize what he did when imprisoned, actually. Let's see why he was sent to jail in the first place though. The notorious criminal Clyde Champion Barrow was first arrested in 1926 for automobile theft after failing to return a car he had rented in Dallas to visit an estranged high school girlfriend. The rental car agency dropped the charges, but the incident remained on Clyde's arrest record. Just 3 weeks later, he was arrested again alongside his older brother Ivan Buck Barrow for an even more farcical crime, possession of a truckload of stolen turkeys. The turkeys, turns out, were stolen, and both brothers were arrested after cops found out. Clyde didn't go to jail that time at least, but the incident earned him a reputation. Number 3, Clyde knew they'd get caught eventually. On the road with Bonnie, Clyde uttered these chillingly sad words. You and me traveling together, we could cut a path clean across this state and Kansas and Missouri and Oklahoma and everybody'd know about it. It seems he really just accepted the fact that their faces and deeds would be all over the country by that time. There was nowhere they'd be really actually safe from the police. In recent studies, some scientists and psychologists suggest that Clyde had a mental illness called antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is a particularly challenging type of personality disorder characterized by impulsive, irresponsible, and often criminal behavior. Someone with antisocial personality disorder will typically be manipulative, deceitful, and reckless, and will not care for other people's feelings. These traits are seen in Clyde's behavior during his spree with Bonnie, but at least here he gave her a subtle warning that they would probably end up gone. Number 2. What did Bonnie's original husband say about the two being executed in the street? While Bonnie had gotten married a few years before, she spent only a few months with her husband before he was sent to jail in 1929. Bonnie never saw him again. She met Clyde in January of 1930, but shortly after, Clyde was arrested for car theft. It was Bonnie who had smuggled a gun into the jail and on one of her visits helped Barrow escape. Clyde was recaptured rather quickly and was sent back to prison. When he was finally released from prison, he and Bonnie hooked up together immediately. Not that he seemed to mind. Bonnie Parker's husband, Roy Thornton, heard that Bonnie and Clyde had been shot. He is quoted as saying, "I'm glad they jumped out when they did. It's much better than being caught." Were the criminals really in love though? Well, only the long gone couple could answer this question, but it seems pretty clear that they were, at least later on. Number 1, Bonnie's poem On the Run. This last quote hits a bit hard for me, and let me know if it does for you guys too in the comments below. If a policeman is ended in Dallas and they have no clue or guide, if they can't find a fiend, they just wipe their slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. There's 2 crimes committed in America not accredited to the Barrow mob. They had no hand in the kidnap demand, nor the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, "I wish old Clyde would get jumped. In these awful hard times, we'd make a few dimes if 5 or 6 cops would get bumped." Thanks for watching. Leave a like and comment if you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time on Crime Time, where I, next time, will have a girlfriend. Probably not though.